Boughton Law is CKNW's on-air legal analyst for 2015, and I didn't think that on-air legal analysis would also dovetail into an examination of the BC Provincial Budget. But that is what we are going to talk about right now with George Cadman, QC with Boughton Law. Hello, George. How are you today?
I'm fine, Mike. Thank you.
So how does this come together? I mean, between the legal community and the idea of focusing on a provincial budget?
Well, a provincial budget, for business at least, drives the economy. And so as the economy goes, so goes the need to, if you'll pardon the expression, lawyer up and advise folks on what initiatives are coming down the pipe.
Well, and we also forget how much conversation goes on between government and any citizens or corporations and all those things, and the budget deeply affects some of those relationships.
It does, very definitely.
So a lot of people have termed this a boring budget. George, what is your thought on this budget and the idea of it being boring?
Yeah, I would be tempted to use the word uneventful. It's kind of like an airplane ride. You want it to be uneventful, but you still want it to get you to where you need to go when you need to get there.
So what is the purpose of the budget, and what did you see in this one in particular?
Well, the purpose of the budget, and this government a number of years ago established a 3-year financial plan approach, was really to carry forward with some of that financial plan to look at some key priority areas, both on a personal level as it affects the individual taxpayer in the province and on a business level. So what incentives, what tax credits, where spending can be used to optimize return for the province, those kinds of things.
Well, capital expenditures are always a big part of a budget, and those, of course, relate directly to economic opportunity and the government injecting sometimes some jobs and some opportunities into the budget.
Right, but it's important to understand that you have essentially two pieces of the budget. You have what I would call the operating budget, which is how much revenue are we bringing in the front door, how much expenditures are we sending out the back door, like you or I would have on a daily basis. And then there's the capital budget, which is actually what are we going to put into infrastructure, over how long, and for what purpose. And that's a lot of what we saw the other day in terms of the minister's announcements on transportation infrastructure, on investment into communities, that kind of thing.
George, don't get me started on transportation infrastructure
I
in
know.
Greater Vancouver. But what did this budget show? What are the priorities that you saw in the budget?
So the priorities, I think, consistent with what was an equally, if you'll pardon the expression, uneventful throne speech, were the priorities around trade, investment, particularly education and skills training. So we actually saw some financial commitments made to upgrading of skills training, which when they're put together with what the federal government has brought to the table in terms of apprenticeship loan grants, actually really bolster the longer-term skills development program.
Yeah, because there was a lot of criticism previous to this about things like our apprenticeship infrastructure and what we had built around it. And this did address a lot of that. I mean, there was $5.4 million, I think, for Aboriginal skills training. And other areas as well. I mean, aerospace, there were a few that the government really actually focused on in the line items.
Yeah, very definitely. The government a number of years ago and as recently as this year identified that skills gap. So the need for 4,300 minimum new trade jobs over the course of the next 5 years. There is lead time involved in that. And so that's where those financial commitments came into play. The other interesting area, we live in a city where we focus on digital media, on green technology. Again, some further commitments made to that, including a huge, and again, we come back to capital expenditures, a huge capital commitment to the Emily Carr University and development of their digital arts programs. So,
because it's easy, people focus, and I think rightly, on the huge portfolios of education and healthcare. But when you come down to the minutia, that's often where these incentives really play into the economic benefits. Can I ask about? You had one written down here, the BC Access Grant. What is that, George?
So the BC Access Grant is actually what I would call the initial layer of the skills training program. So up to $16,400 being made available on a per student basis by the provincial government to fund that apprenticeship training. Layered on top of that now is the federal government apprenticeship loan program, which realistically converts to, for some families, particularly if you're going into the trades, and you have a young family, you have the ability to access up to around $50,000 over the life of your trades program.
Unbelievable. And that obviously incentivizes business as well to take on apprentices, because that's obviously a hesitation sometimes for business.
Yeah, it is. And frankly, we have a lot to learn from some of the European models around apprenticeship training, where somebody comes into the business and is essentially groomed in a position. Yeah. The aerospace industry happens to be one of those, where a longer-term commitment to apprenticeship training in the aerospace industry pays huge dividends down the road.
We are joined by George Cadman from Boughton Law. We're talking about the most recent, or the recent, as of yesterday, BC provincial government. Now, George, we talked about some of the incentives that the government has built into skills training, and part of that would play back into the liquefied natural gas aspirations of BC and the BC government, and yet not a lot of mention or reliance, obviously, on LNG revenues in the budget.
Right. And again, that's, frankly, I think that's not surprising.
Yeah.
You can't book the revenue or project the revenue unless you actually have some final investment decisions. And that's what the minister said yesterday. We don't have those FIDs, the final investment decisions. And so we're going to be conservative. We're small c conservative.
Yeah.
And we're not going to project those revenues until we know they're going to start flowing.
Yeah, which is the proper and competent way to run a budget for a province. But again, it shows, obviously, through the priorities we talked about in the last section, like things like the BC Access Grant, that, you mentioned that putting those things in a budget creates the long-term benefit of having skilled employees for when and if the LNG industry actually happens in BC.
Yeah, if you look at whether it's this 3-year fiscal plan or whether it was the preceding one, it's designed to lay the foundation for what will hopefully be a very prosperous economy over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
But you've got to get the building blocks in place before you move on to the next phase. And some of that is if you'll pardon the expression, some of that is the mundane legislation that will be coming down the pipe over the course of this legislative session.
George, you're making it sound like the government actually had a plan in place as they created their budget. We try and pick these things apart. But talk about that idea as well, and the budget and what it showed in terms of the focus on small and medium-sized business, because you mentioned that 3 to 5 year plan that the government has been basing these budgets on. What did it show in terms of medium and small-sized business in the future?
Yeah, so I think what it showed was actually a certain degree of certainty. It showed that the government has made a longer-term commitment to keeping tax rates where they were for small business. Made a longer-term commitment to some incentives in some key areas of the economy. So, as I said earlier, digital media, green technology.
Yeah.
Vancouver is becoming an incubator for that.
Yeah.
And the incentives provided to what are theoretically small to medium-sized businesses as they get started are very important. Bringing people to the table with the right skills are very important to small and medium-sized business.
Well, and we have to make sure that, because I was quite critical of the government last year, because I know a lot of people that are in the tech industry that want to either return to Vancouver, that have been here, so technology and digital media, and can't because the companies aren't here to support that. And this is really that, we have to create the incentives for companies to come here in the first place. place.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see some of that. So in the building right next door, as they redevelop Pacific Center, we're going to see Microsoft come in.
Yeah,
we're going to see Disney come in through one of their subsidiaries.
Yeah.
So the framework is being put in place, and it then becomes a question of how do you build on that? How does the average business person, with the certainty that this budget has given and some of the fiscal plans have given, how do they make their own investment back into their own business?
Marvelous stuff. George Cadman, thank you so much for joining us from Boughton Law. Thanks, George.
My pleasure.